This is American Psycho. This is My Hero Academia. What do they have in common? They're both literature, and I am a literature student. Yes, in case you don't know me, I am Dennis, you may know me as Oceaniz, and I study literature of the English language at the University of Zurich. And well, it's not what you would consider a cool subject, but it is nonetheless interesting, and it gives me the right to sit here and be an asshole about cartoons. Isn't that great? So, I thought that today I would do something that apparently is really trending right now on YouTube, which is ex-professional reviews slash reacts slash analyzes slash whatever popular thing. And I would put my literary megamind to use and talk about every arc in My Hero Academia in a quick fire analysis round. I'm not going to go too in depth because if I do one video where I cover everything, I'm out of a job. So this is just going to be a quick fire round, and if you want more in-depth reviews and analyses, you can watch my other videos or my analysis session with Ian, all on the channel. You'll find it. I believe in you. Now, the best way to start is at the start. The UA Beginning Saga, which is what people generally refer to as the prologue of My Hero Academia, consists of the first couple of arcs of Deku going to UA, fighting Bakugo, and then the USJ attack. While those can count as separate arcs, I don't, because they all have one goal and one goal only. Do you like the series yet? Yes or no? That's all this arc asks, and that's all this arc wants to know. It is all just about making you like and enjoy Deku's narrative of change and of growth. This narrative of becoming someone you've always wanted to be. You may know this as the underdog trope, although that word gets misused a lot. But generally, this story is all about putting Deku into places he thought he could never be in. At school, fighting his actual rival, which as of right now had only been his bully, and right in front of a villain attack where he has to prove himself all alongside his mentor. This is a sort of fish out of water kind of story where you end up having a character grow through circumstances that they would usually not encounter. They go against their core nature, despite them knowing that that's really what they actually want. And so this arc works as a very nice beginning portion of the story, because we are very much in the same position as Deku. We're trying to learn about this world, we're trying to understand what's the deal with superpowers and with this society. And so, as a beginning arc, it sets all that up perfectly. It also starts us off with the questions regarding hero society, although here it's kind of subverted. We have Shigaraki who tells All Might that, oh, you heroes are so hypocritical because you use violence and then it's good, but we use violence and it's bad. And All Might basically tells him, you're a fucking idiot, that's not how it works. And it's interesting to see that that was something they brought up this early, only to dismiss it, when, you know, if you've read the manga, currently that's the hot topic. If there is one arc My Hero Academia is actually properly known for, it's the Sports Festival arc. The arc that made everyone like the show. And for good reason. It is the first time the show really stretches its legs into some interesting territory, where you have the narrative of Shoto and his whole story with his father and his family. And what's important here is not necessarily to get into granularities of that, but that what we have here is the story of people having to deal and overcome with what they've been burdened with. Deku, in a way, does the same thing. He is burdened with All Might's "tell the world you are here" speech, which sounds inspirational at first, but is nonetheless a burden, something that becomes more apparent as the story goes on. And Shoto becomes the vehicle of telling us this before actually delving into it through Deku. Shoto's example is a lot more blatant. My dad is an abusive piece of shit, and now I have to bear this burden with me. And so therefore we get acquainted to this idea of the burden narrative, which we then later will refine in Deku. And, you know, aside from that, it's a fun arc, but narratively not super dense. Most of it is just about, hey, Shoto has a problem and Deku will help him. Isn't that great for both of their characters? And that's perfectly fine. Another super popular arc is the Stain arc, which has our friends fight against their first real villain. And you can tell that the story really shifts gears here, because suddenly it's not necessarily about school shenanigans and, oh, isn't the hero world fun? We start really getting into this idea of the hero world being a lot shittier than you might expect. However, what's interesting to note here is that Stain is wrong. Stain is hilariously wrong and hypocritical about his point. His main complaint with Hero Society is that it's a for-profit endeavor that does not actually care about altruism and heroism. fair enough. But killing people in broad daylight isn't exactly a solution. You're creating more suffering than the capitalist hero society ever did. So in the end, while Stein's ideals were founded in something very real and very understandable, he himself is a failed revolutionary, a 20-something loser who is just dissatisfied with his world and thinks that the world has to bend to his will because he is sad about the state of everything. Anyway, basically, this is another story beat that focuses on changing, that focuses on putting yourself into situations that you might otherwise not prefer. In this case, it's Ida, having to take up the mantle of Ingenium, even though he isn't really ready yet. And therefore, we essentially get this sort of nice, tied-up bow towards the first sort of section of MHA, where up until now, pretty much every story beat has been about trying to change, trying to move past beyond what burdens you, and trying to move past the limitations that society or you yourself have placed upon you, which you could say is a quintessential shonen narrative. If the Stein arc is the end of the changing narrative section of My Hero Academia, then the summer exams arc is the epilogue to it. It is the final test for a lot of these characters to show that they've grown beyond what they were at the start, as well as for many of them to really show off for the very first time. Additionally, it also gives us our first glimpse into Bakugo, which is important because he is a very, very crucial character. And more importantly, we get to see how he reacts to the narrative of change that Deku has gone on so far. His whole character is essentially based on looking at the narrative that we discussed before and reacting to it. Bakugo is basically My Hero Academia's reaction channel, isn't that funny? And also, it is a glimpse into a future where you overcome your personal gripes, where you move forward towards heroism despite all the things that might differentiate you from your peers. And again, it carries this notion of growing beyond everything and also carrying everyone alongside with you. So yeah, again, quintessential shonen stuff, but done through a lens that is usually quite atypical. I'm just gonna bring the Forest Raid and the Camino arc together into one big Clash arc. This is the climax of the entire first section of My Hero Academia. We've seen this narrative of change, we've seen this narrative of moving beyond the past, and well, this is what happens. The past dies, or at least gets crippled so much that it cannot help you in your schoolwork anymore. This section of the story essentially is Horikoshi and the story itself telling us, alright, you wanted to change, here it is. Here is something that will inevitably and irreparably change the entire world and the story. And so we get this final clash between these ancient pillars of society, and we see that they themselves are barely keeping up. They are a shadow of their former selves, and it is time for both of them to retire one way or another. And this is also seen in the Forest Raid arc itself, where we see that the old trying to intercept the new causes the first big loss and the first big negative down point of the story. The old tries to affect the new, all for one, and trying to meddle with the kids, really sends us into our first pit of despair, showing us why these old forces need to go. And it's similar with All Might. All Might, who takes the responsibility for everything and in turn makes the rest of society weaker because he doesn't lift them up alongside himself, which is very different to how the other students have so far been handling the story. So, picture this, the world has changed. Now what? That is the central analytical question behind the license exam arc. And while the arc itself is sort of messy because it tries very hard to be the fun, lighthearted arc after the darkness, it is nonetheless fundamentally about moving on from what has happened, moving on from change. It is essentially the question of, you wanted to become someone else so badly. You wanted everything to be different so badly. Alright, here you go. Now what? And this is of course also emblemized in the final fight between our two main rivals, where they both have to come to terms that they have both changed and that those changes don't just affect themselves but each other. More importantly, of course, with Bakugo, who has to come to terms with the fact that his position in the world has changed a lot. Again, change is the key word here. My Hero Academia, like many shonen stories, deals with the idea that everything is in flux and that trying to grab onto the things that don't change might not be very useful in the long run. Speaking of change, what's the opposite of change? What's the opposite of progress? Congress? No, regress. And regress is exactly what Kai Chisaki wants in the overall arc, which is one of the longest arcs in the series to date, and honestly, for good reason. It deals with something that is actually pretty interesting, namely the idea that maybe changing things wasn't such a good idea. Maybe it's important to go back to the roots. Of course, Overhaul is a psychopath, so this idea doesn't carry much weight, but it still negotiates this idea of the past versus the future. Do we move forward into something that is unknown, something that might not work, or do we retreat into what has worked before? This is also, not coincidentally, the first arc where Deku really has to do pro-hero work pretty much all by himself. Sure, he's backed up by Mirio and Night Eye, but he is mostly isolated from his other students, from his core group. And it's also the first time where his hero work affects him in a mature and pro-hero-like way. And so this is the point of the story that negotiates with us the idea that the future isn't really as easy, that you've changed, and you might have accepted that you've changed, but the world will not really accommodate you, and maybe, just maybe, it wasn't such a great idea. But of course, in the end, Deku has to persevere and to move forward, to make that future happen for the sake of all the young smiles that he might protect. If someone asks you what's one of the best arcs in My Hero Academia, there's one correct answer, and it's the Culture Festival. Not just because it includes the single best villain in all of My Hero Academia, it is also a supremely well tied together story that again tells us a lot about its characters and world while being incredibly low stakes. It focuses not on the destruction of society or the drug cartel or whatever. It focuses on the fact that, well, hero work is all well and good, but it has real life consequences. Consequences that are not as epic as buildings falling apart. Sometimes all you need to fight for is people having a good time, people being able to move away and move on from the troubles that they've seen. And this is an arc that isn't incredibly complicated, it isn't incredibly profound, but because this is an idea that is so often ignored in so much power fiction, it is very, very cool to see it here, and done very well, because Gentle himself is someone who could never move on, who was never given the opportunity or even the space to move on from his failures and hardships. He is stuck in the past and cannot really change. All he can do is try to cling to his own ideals and hope that they mean something, while he, in the end, of course, realizes that he does have something else, namely the companionship and love of his partner, La Brava. The Fried Chicken arc is notable in the sense that, well, it tries to do something incredibly hard. It tries to take, maybe at this point, the most despicable character on the hero side and make him the protagonist, which is very brave, and again, intersects with the idea of changing. How can someone change? How far can you even expect change from people? And more importantly, is it your responsibility to accept change, even when it comes at such a long time coming? And well, it doesn't really give you an answer, instead it just presents you with an interesting idea. Namely the idea that, well, trying is worth something. Trying is not worthless, but at the same time, the unique perspectives that have formed around certain happenings, certain characters like Endeavor, are just not negotiable with the idea of change. Someone like Natsuo cannot forgive Endeavor for what he's done, no matter how much Endeavor wants him to. And maybe wanting people to forgive is not the way to go. Maybe atonement and forgiveness are two different things. And this arc is a very nice setup for the suffering that Endeavor would have to endure in the arcs to come. The Joint Training arc. Does it need any introduction? Infamous, not particularly beloved, and slow, and well, that kind of carries into the themes and the analysis as well. There isn't a whole lot in here. Again, you can look at it under the lens of change, under the lens of having to recapitulate how you have grown, but also, and maybe more importantly in the case of Deku, to realize that the ways in which you've grown might not necessarily be ways that you have control over. When One For All explodes, he is terrified at the idea that all of his changes will be undone, and then realizes that his own fear of One For All was what led him down to having such outbursts. And that is interesting because it again engages with the idea that change can come from many different factors, and that sometimes it's important to step back and ask yourself, what does this progress, this movement towards my goal actually mean to me, and how I've been approaching it from an attitude perspective. And from that angle, this arc actually becomes pretty interesting, because a lot of characters in here end up having a dialogue on what their power and what their progress means to them. most importantly, maybe Monoma and Shinso, who very much talk very openly about the fact that they're not sure where they stand in the world, but they want to stand somewhere. If there's one wildcard that no one really saw coming, and if you think you saw it coming, you're a liar, it's the peak fiction arc, which is really weird in a lot of ways. It somewhat comes out of nowhere if you really think about it. We have this one section of the students fighting and having fun amongst each other, and then you get this bizarre arc of just the villains being the focus and the villains being treated as the protagonists. And that is super interesting because of how villains are usually portrayed in fiction. Evil in fiction is often a stagnant, stable force, something a hero has to budge and push in order to get rid of. Think of Lord of the Rings, think of Harry Potter, think of Star Wars, think of all your favorite shows, and I can guarantee you most of them have their bad guy as something that is incredibly strong and already pretty developed. They might not be the king yet, or they might not be in position of ruling yet, but they are still nonetheless strong, confident, and decided on what they want to do. And My Villain Academia is interesting because it completely shits on that. It decides, no, you know what? We've seen our villain be a piece of shit for 200 chapters. Why don't we show you an arc where he becomes an actual leader? Someone who learns how to manipulate the people around him. Someone who learns how to use resources. Someone who can challenge the underworld and win. And it's more importantly that this is a villain versus villain arc, because that again plays into this idea of villainy and evil in general not being a monolith, but a power-hungry ocean of different factions trying to veer for control, which again makes them more scary. Because think about it, if you had one guy you had to defeat and then everything's fine, okay, bullet. But when you have something like this, an entire ecosystem of evildoers, that is much harder to take apart. And this is only the first layer, because of course, once you read into the arc, you realize the real... I'm gonna have to stop myself because I'm gonna say an absolute lunchbox quote. The real villain was society all along. But I really do mean it. In a lot of these stories, you see that the evil that we see now at display, the murder, the violence that we see done in this arc, is not by itself born out of nothing, but instead the consequence of neglect and cruelty within proper society. And this is maybe the point where my hero properly decides on what to do with its narrative about change, and especially societal change. Namely that it's all well and good that the good people, the heroes, the kids can sit there and ponder about their own changing minds and powers, but not everyone's as fortunate. And perhaps it is time for society itself to change. The Endeavor Agency arc is in a lot of ways the sequel to the Pro Hero arc. It is the first time we see Endeavor in proper fashion again after it, but more importantly, it again deals with his family, and it again deals with the question of, can someone like him really change? And even if he can, does it matter? Is it too late? And this arc makes a good argument for why it's too late, as we learn that he apparently caused the death of one of his kids. Something that, well, doesn't matter how much goodwill you have, it's not easy to bounce back from. But it also again shows us why there is such an importance placed on Endeavor as a person, because he is not just a guy anymore. He is the pillar, the shining light that has to keep society from changing, from devolving into a mess, into chaos. And so what you have here is this sort of duplicitous narrative where you get to see Endeavor as the hero when he's taking care of the kids, and Endeavor as the family man when you get to the Todoroki house. And you get to see both of them collapse in the scene where Natsu's in danger, and one of them wins, and it's not the hero. Endeavor is a father, a man who wants to do better, and in that moment of worrying about his child, of seeing his son in danger, he shows his true colors. He is scared, he's terrified. He is a man who's lost everything and who's scared he will lose even the small bits of family he still has left. And while you can't really force anyone to see this as a good thing, again, he is a piece of shit after all, that is nonetheless an interesting way to depict a character like that, because it shows us multiple angles and gives us an idea and an understanding of what might be going on in his head. The Paranormal Liberation War arc is big. It is dense, and it is not easy to come up with a central analysis for it because there's a lot of things happening in there. I could focus on Twice, I could focus on Hawks, I could focus on Deku and Shigaraki, but really the fundamental thing is that it again is a climax arc like the Kamino arc, and it is again fundamentally about the world undergoing an irreparable change. And this time, it is even worse than last time. Because this time, it is not the failure of old institutions that are so decrepit they cannot keep the world afloat anymore. Now it is the victory of those who want to crumble every institution, new and old. It is the victory of those who see that society has moved on so far from the goals of heroism and equality that they cannot see it withstand any longer. And so what this arc presents is the awakening of an evil, the awakening of a force that wants to push society to its brink in order to have it change into a better version for itself. And that better version might just be, well, utter destruction, because at least no kids are left starving on the streets anymore, and there isn't a huge disparity anymore. Cynical, but not invalid entirely. And so essentially what we have here is change being pushed for the sake of pure change, for the sake of moving away from the old, even if it means utter chaos and annihilation. And you see this in all small characters. You see it in Hawks, who tries and tries to get Twice to move on one final time, to change into the direction of being a hero, of being protected by the heroes, and Twice refusing and instead going into the complete opposite direction, moving forward into change towards destruction. You see it in narratives like Dabi, who interestingly wants to bring about big changes in society but is himself stuck in the past. As he himself says, he is the past that will never die. And it all comes together in Shigaraki, who is the single bringer of devastation in this world that he deems necessary for change. None of these are what you would call objectively correct interpretations. These are all off the cuff. I in fact barely even scripted this, so you could always correct and go further. And of course you've noticed that I was mostly focusing on the theme of change. But what's important here to note is that My Hero Academia is a story about negotiating change, negotiating progress versus the reality that progress is not a unilaterally accepted and good thing, be it in your personal life or in your larger societal life. But yeah, there you have it. All My Hero Academia arcs reviewed and analyzed. And wow, I am so sweaty because there is a lot of shit in these. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed. Thank you so much for watching. This was a bit of a weird thing, but hey, I hope you enjoyed it. And thank you, of course, to all our patrons, including Daniel Garcia, Fiction Ape, Jameson Tate, Cini, Victor Perez, Cesar Londono, Ignis, Mr. Meander, and Paracha. I hope you all have a nice day, and I'll see you around. Bye-bye.